This lab can do a couple of things. Number one, it can serve as a reinforcement regarding how distributed switches work. And secondly, it's an opportunity to practice in a non-production environment in migrating VM kernel adapters over to a distributed switch. And the cool thing about a lab environment, you can do it multiple times, you can practice over and over, and if it fails or if you make a misstep, it's no big deal. Start the lab again and you're good to go. So currently, supporting our storage network, we have two switches. We have vSwitch 2 and vSwitch 4. And this is replicated virtually identically across the other two ESXi hosts as well, except the IP addresses have been changed to protect the innocent. Meaning ESXi2s end in 2 and ESXi3s end in 3. So with these standard switches behind them, we have VM kernel adapters, which are associated with these switches with VM kernel ports. And that's allowing our ESXi host to have iSCSI multipathing as they communicate with the iSCSI target. And these uplinks are VMNIC2 and VMNIC3 respectively. So that's how our current plumbing works. What I propose we do is let's create two new distributed switches. And regarding these distributed switches, let's name them something like storage A and storage B. And I'm putting A on the right and B on the left because down here I have our standard switch 2 and standard switch 4, which was our first and second switches respectively that we're using just for the storage network. And on these virtual distributed switches, when we create them, we will create a port group on each of them, and the switches will automatically create an uplink port group on each of them for us. So here's what we could do. Once we create the logical distributed switches, we can then add the hosts, ESXi 1, 2, and 3, into the party so that they can each use the logical distributed switch. And then we can migrate the resources over. For example, VMNIC3, we can migrate over and associate with the uplink for this switch called storage B. And for VMNIC2, we can migrate that over and associate that with the logical uplink on the switch called storage A. And we can take the VM kernel adapter that's currently associated with the standard switch, and we can migrate it over to the port group on storage B. And we can take this VM kernel adapter and associate it with the port group over on the switch called storage A. And what we've effectively done is we've effectively removed switch 4 and removed switch 2, the two standard switches, from the picture. They're no longer going to be used. And instead, each of the ESXi hosts will be using in their place the storage A and storage B virtual distributed switches. Now the benefit, again, of having a distributed switch is that if we have 50 ESXi hosts and they're all using the distributed switch, and that way we don't have to go and modify 50 different individual standard switches on each of the ESXi hosts. We can make policy changes to the distributed switch, and because the ESXi hosts are using the distributed switch, the policy is implemented immediately. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through this step by step, and I would encourage you to practice this hands-on in this safe hands-on lab environment that we provide. So here in the vSphere web client, the first thing we want to do is create a couple of additional distributed switches. To do so, we'll click on the networking icon, and then we'll right-click on the Las Vegas Data Center, and from the Actions menu, hover over Distributed Switch, and from the submenu, click New Distributed Switch. And for this first one, let's name it storage_A_VDS for Virtual Distributed Switch, and click on Next. If we had any older ESXi hosts that would be using this switch, we'd have to go ahead and compromise, but all of our ESXi hosts are 6.5, so we'll go ahead and leave that top radio button selected and click Next. Now, regarding the number of uplinks, we're going to create two new virtual switches, and each of them only really need one uplink. That's to support VMNIC2 and VMNIC3 respectively on each of the ESXi hosts. So I'm going to go ahead and crank this number down just to one uplink on this virtual distributed switch. Network I/O control is enabled by default, and we do want to create a port group. So let's name it storage_A_VDS_port group. And in a production environment, we might not need to spell it all out like that, but in the lab, I want to make it very easy for you and I. When we see that port group, we'll know exactly what it is and where it belongs. This is a port group on the new Storage A virtual distributed switch. So we'll go ahead and click Next to continue. Here's a summary, and we'll click on Finish. Fantastic. Let's do it again. We'll right-click on the data center, and now we'll create Storage B VDS. So from the Actions menu for the Las Vegas Data Center, we'll hover over Distributed Switch, and from the submenu select New Distributed Switch. We'll name this storage_B_VDS. So if we scooch this over a little bit, the switch we created a moment ago was called storage_A. This will be storage_B. Fantastic. We'll click on Next. We'll accept the radio button for version 6.5, click Next. We'll reduce the number of uplinks to 1, and we'll specify the name of the port group that we want created on this distributed switch. So we'll name this storage underscore B underscore VDS underscore port group and click on Next. And then click on Finish. And ta-da! We now have 2 new distributed switches. So here's our original one, D switch, and now we have the storage A and storage B virtual distributed switches as well. And if we expand them, we can see the uplinks group, and we can also see the port groups. So you know what one of the big challenges is with these 2 new distributed switches is that no hosts are currently using them, and as a result, we don't have any uplinks from those hosts or VM kernel adapters or VMs or anything else associated from those ESXi hosts with these distributed switches. So what we need to do is invite some hosts to go ahead and start using this distributed switch. And we're going to do it for both switches. So with the switch named Storage A VDS selected, we could right click on it, and from the menu we could click on Add and Manage Hosts. And there's also another shortcut for that bad boy right up there if we wanted to use that as well. So we'll go ahead and click on Add and Manage Hosts regarding our first switch, and I'm going to drag this over just a little bit, just as a visual reminder regarding which switch we're working with. And because we need to add some ESXi hosts to use this distributed switch and modify some of the VM kernel adapters to participate with the distributed switch, we're going to choose this last option to add host and manage host networking and click on Next. Now it's saying, okay, what new host do you want to bring to the party? So we'll click on the new host link here, and we'll go ahead and simply bring in all 3 of our ESXi hosts. And with them all selected, we'll click on OK. So down below we have an option to bring in those hosts and configure them using a template mode. We've done that previously when we created our first distributed switch. So for this one, let's do them individually without using template mode. So we'll simply click on Next. Now it's asking us, okay, what do you want to do? Well, the first option is Manage Physical Adapters. And we do need to do this one. We need to bring in VMNIC2, which is currently associated with Standard Switch 2. Supporting our iSCSI connectivity, we need to bring that over to this new distributed switch. So we'll leave this checked. And we also need to bring over the VM kernel adapter that's currently associated with Switch 2. That's bound to the iSCSI host adapter that's providing the connectivity from the ESXi host over to the iSCSI target. So we're going to go ahead and leave both of these checked. And because we do not have any virtual machines that are going to need direct access to a port group on this switch, we're going to leave this last checkbox unchecked. And then we'll click on Next. So now it's asking us about physical network adapters that we want to associate with the distributed switch. And for each of the ESXi hosts, we want VMNIC2 to be associated with this storage A switch. So we'll select VMNIC2 for ESXi1 and click Assign Uplink. We'll go ahead and click on Uplink 1 and click OK. And then we'll repeat that for ESXi2 and ESXi3. So for ESXi2, we'll select VMNIC2, click on Assign Uplink, click on Uplink 1, click OK, and then we'll scroll down in this output, go down to ESXi3, select VMNIC2, click on Assign Uplink, assign that to Uplink 1 on the distributed switch, click OK, and we're good to go. So we'll click on Next to continue. Next, it's asking us about VM kernel adapters, and the reason it's got this little warning symbol here on each of these VMK1s for each of our hosts is that we might lose network connectivity based on our current configuration on those hosts. So currently, VMK1 is associated with vSwitch 2, which is using the uplink of VMNIC2. Well, we just told the configuration that we want to move VMNIC2 off of vSwitch 2 and over to the new distributed switch. So this warning is just saying if you don't bring this VM kernel adapter over with you, you could have some connectivity problems connecting to the outside network using the IP address associated with this VM kernel adapter as the source. So we knew that coming in. So what we'll do is we'll click on VMK1 and click Assign Port Group. And because we only have one port group that we created when we created that switch, we'll go ahead and click on that port group and click on OK. And we'll repeat that process for the VMK1 kernel adapter on each of our ESXi hosts. So we'll select it, click on Assign to Port Group, select the port group, click OK, scroll down, and we'll repeat that for ESXi3. VMK1, assign port group, assign it to the distributed switch port group, and click OK. And we can also check our work right here. So this VM kernel adapter, VMK1, which had been associated with vSwitch 2 through a port group called Storage A, is going to be reassigned to the distributed switch port group called Storage A underscore VDS underscore port group. So we'll take a moment, confirm that, and then click on Next. Now it's doing a quick impact analysis. If we only had that one VM kernel that was bound to the host bus adapter for iSCSI, and we took the one uplink that VM kernel adapter and port we're using, and we assigned it to a distributed switch without bringing the VM kernel, it would be telling us here, whoa, 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 you're cutting off your connectivity. So in our case, we're not, because we brought over the uplink, VMNIC2, and we also brought over the VM kernel adapter. So we'll go ahead and click on Next to continue. And this is where in a production environment, you better have that change control form signed, approved, be in the change window before we click on Finish. Because if this goes poorly, and if that was our only connectivity over to the iSCSI target from the ESXi host, we could have a major, major problem on our hands. So it's done, and if we expand the topology here, so this is confirming for us that we have 3 VM kernel adapters, one from ESXi 1, 2, and 3 respectively, that are associated with this distributed switch via this port group, and we have 3 uplinks, one from each of our ESXi hosts using VMNIC2 that are connecting this distributed switch over to our storage network. So our iSCSI multipath that we set up in the previous nugget should still be functional. We have one of those paths going through the distributed switch, and we have the other one still going through the standard switch. And just to verify that real quick, if we go back to our hosts and clusters right here, and just let's grab ESXi2. And with ESXi2 selected, if we click on the Configure tab, and then under Storage, go to Storage Adapters, and then click on our iSCSI host bus adapter, and then click on Network Port Binding. Let me go ahead and resize these columns just a little bit. This is a very good sign. So we have 2 bindings, VMK1 and VMK3, and they're coming in through 2 port groups. We have a port group on our distributed switch for VMK1, that's the one we just migrated, and we have the other one that's still coming in through the standard switch through a VM kernel port called storage_B on vSwitch 4. So let's go back to networking, and we'll do that again to hook up the second side of our iSCSI multipathing to also use a distributed switch, but for side B, we'll use the second distributed switch. So with this second distributed switch that we set up for the purpose of supporting our storage, we'll right-click on it, and we'll select Add and Manage Hosts. And we can do this one just a little bit faster because it's exactly the same process. We're going to go ahead and use the last radio button here that gives us all the options. Click on Next, click on New Hosts, go ahead and select all the ESXi hosts to tell them they can use this distributed switch. Click OK, click Next, and for the second switch for the storage, we're going to be using VMNIC 3. So with those 2 top check boxes selected, we'll click on Next. So we want VMNIC 3 on each of these to be associated with the distributed switch. So with VMNIC 3 for ESXi 1 selected, we'll click on Assign Uplink, click Uplink 1, click OK, and then we'll repeat that for ESXi 2 and ESXi 3. We'll select the uplink, click on Assign Uplink, choose the logical uplink in the virtual distributed switch, click OK, and then repeat that for ESXi 3. VMNIC 3, Assign Uplink, Uplink 1, OK. And then I'm just going to scan through my work and make sure I got the right ones. And they look good. So the uplink is going to be stolen from the standard switch vSwitch 4, and it's going to be allocated over to the distributed switch as part of the uplink group. And then we'll click on Next. Next, we're going to bring over the VM kernel adapters. It's making it a little bit obvious for us here because it puts a little warning symbol on each of the ones that are going to be in trouble if we don't migrate them. So we're going to migrate VMK3, which is a VM kernel adapter currently associated with vSwitch 4 standard switch, and it's associated with that switch through a VM kernel port that's named storage_B. So we'll go ahead and click VMK3, click on Assign Port Group. We'll click on the single port group that we created when we created this second switch for storage, and we'll click on OK. And then we'll repeat that process for the other 2 as well. So VMK3, Assign Port, select the port group on the distributed switch, click OK, and scroll down, and we'll do that for ESXi3 as well. Clicking VMK3, Assign to port, grabbing the port group, clicking OK. And then we'll click Next. We'll go ahead and click on Next. There's a summary of what it's about to do, and click on Finish. Then we'll click on Recent Tasks, and it is done. Fantastic. So we'll minimize recent tasks, and then just as a check, let's go over to our Host and Clusters tab right here. And with ESXi2 selected and on the Configure tab and clicking on Storage Adapters, let's click on the iSCSI software adapter. Click on Network Port Binding, and that looks good. Both path statuses are active, and both of the port groups represent the distributed switch port groups, one from our distributed switch A and the other from the distributed switch B. Another thing to try, just to verify that we haven't lost connectivity to our iSCSI data store, is to click on the Storage tab right here, and then click on the iSCSI data store. And currently we're on the Files tab, and so if we simply open up a folder, let's click on VM4 to look at the files in that folder, and that's coming up. So what that means in measurable terms is this is information that's being pulled off of the iSCSI data store. So if we can see these files here, that's another really good indicator that the ESXi host, or at least the one that's being used on the behalf of vCenter to show us this view, has full connectivity over to the iSCSI data store, leveraging the virtual distributed switch that we just migrated the VM NICs and the VM kernel adapters to. So have some fun in the lab. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.